Peninsula Foundation for arranging this and for having me here. It's really difficult to follow Mr. Guruswamy, so I'm going to try my best to, I obviously can't match his wit and charm, but I'm going to try my best to at least present what my views are. And like he said, if the US is going to be dominant perennially, and if China is not necessarily going to be posing a threat, I'm probably going to be out of a job, and I'll add to the dependency ratio in India. Okay, so what I'm going to basically talk about is that, at least in the near term, China is going to pose us a threat, if not in the long term. And the idea of the Indo-Pacific, the question that I've been given, whether it is an anti-China security construct or a platform for development and of safe global commons, the honest answer is it depends on who you are. And that's how you're going to adopt one of these sort of options. And I'll try and make the point here that essentially it's not the rest of the world or even necessarily the United States, although the United States has a role to play in it, which is interested in creating an anti-China construct. It's actually also quite useful for Beijing to articulate that the Indo-Pacific is an anti-China construct. And that's the argument that I'm going to try and make here. I'll also try and put a couple of recommendations, hopefully, for countries in the region who are represented here. So if I could just go to the next slide. So I don't think I should spend too much time on this, since we've all sort of at least had a couple of sessions where we've talked about the strategic significance and the emergence of the Indo-Pacific as a strategic construct. I see three primary reasons, which is the shifting geoeconomic gravity, which we've already talked about. The rise of China as a major power, but not just the rise of China as a major power economically and politically, but also its exercise of power and its abuse of rules, laws, its willingness to be much more risk tolerant in terms of using force to shape outcomes in the region. We've seen that in the border with India. We've seen that in the South China Sea. And that's, I think, one catalyst that is shaping the sort of strategic structure of the Indo-Pacific. And of course, the reassessment of American policy, starting from Obama and the pivot to Asia, to Donald Trump and then under Biden. To me, the United States currently is undergoing, and has been for a decade plus, undergoing this deep internal conversation about what kind of a power is it, and what is it going to be doing at the world stage. And therefore you see this oscillation between some sense of isolationism and need for isolationism to some sense of deeper engagement. And I think there's sort of a confusion in that policy process, which I think will sustain, given the sort of friction that we see in American domestic politics today. I'll sort of briefly take you through the evolution of the US's Indo-Pacific strategy, and I'm doing this to try and answer the question that it's not necessarily all about China. Which is what Beijing would like us to believe. Okay, if you look at the Trump era sort of Indo-Pacific strategy, it was fairly confused, as the entire presidency in some ways was. And what you saw was that there were sort of certain trends that we saw, right? There was a certain amount of call for reciprocity. And this was across its alliance system, where there was a greater call for burden sharing, greater transactionalism in its approach. There was a certain withdrawal, particularly from the TPP. And you saw that sort of friction of whether we should be engaging much more deeply, what should be the nature of our engagement, and if that engagement is, and should that engagement be necessarily of benign American engagement, looking at the broader sort of long-term objectives, or should that be short-term transactionalism? And what we saw that there was some greater sort of focus on short-term transactionalism. Countering China and building congruence with other defense partners with this framework of transactionalism was one of the key parts. And you saw the United States fundamentally start to deal with China much more aggressively across all domains, from economics, politics, diplomacy to the military domain. And despite the frictions in the US alliance system under Trump, you did see at least a steady forward movement in the Indo-US partnership and a focus on the Quad. So that was a sort of an anomaly in some ways. For all the frictions that Donald Trump was having with all other allies, the relationship with India was actually deepening, led by defense ties. Economic ties were still sort of difficult. We remember the sort of Harley-Davidson sort of issue with India and the US. Under the Biden administration, there was sort of an re-evaluation of what needs to be done. In some ways, there was strategic continuity that, yes, you're going to be confronting China, but how should you be doing this? Under Trump, what we saw was that the Indo-Pacific was secondary as a frame, and China and competition with China was the primary frame. Under Biden, there has been an effort to sort of reevaluate that and say, we need to, yes, China is a strategic competitor, we need to continue to deal with that, but we don't necessarily need to look at the Indo-Pacific only from the prism of competition with China. We need to look at it from broader prisms also. And therefore, you've got to sort of had these buzzwords that came out, that competitiveness needs to be expanded domestically, we need to focus on partnerships, our partnerships needs to be based on certain values, and as much as we scoff at the idea of values, I think it's really important, and I'll get to that in my final slides. So yeah, the idea was that there's an acknowledgement of a shifting balance of power, and the fact that we don't necessarily need to put China at the front of our sort of Indo-Pacific approach. This finally culminated in this Indo-Pacific strategy in 2022, which was released. These are the 5 main objectives of the strategy. You can see China sort of is implicitly present in each of these components, and in some of these components, it's likely to be a player in them. So you can't drive regional prosperity without the biggest regional economic player. So there will be a presence of China in some ways, where the idea is to see China as a collaborative partner in some places that you can. For example, you can't address regional issues with regard to, say, resilience and climate change without China being on the table. So in some places, it has to be a partner. But at the same time, there is going to be systemic competition with China. So how do you balance that sort of that struggle between competitiveness, confrontation, and some degree of cooperation? And you can see that within the strategy document, that there is that inherent contradiction and struggle that exists. So it's not necessarily entirely anti-China. The argument is not that it is anti-China. Of course, from Beijing's point of view, the argument is that if you go back to the evolution of this strategy, it was the Defense Department which first had an Indo-Pacific strategy. So one of the primary visions of the Indo-Pacific from the American perspective is that it is driven by a security prism in which the idea is to contain China. But if you look at the shift that's taken place over a period of years, there is a subtle nuance over there which we should note. Okay, this is part of the strategy, and again, if you see implicit in this is China, although it's not necessarily mentioned. But the idea is that you're articulating a certain vision for the region, and in which China needs to play a certain kind of role. That is what the Americans would like them to play. Of course, Beijing has a disagreement with that. Along with that, you've got multiple other countries and groupings which have issued their Indo-Pacific strategies. I've not covered all of them, but a few of them I want to highlight. And again, the reason for doing this is to go and look at whether these are necessarily anti-China, and what sort of, implicitly, what sort of role do they envision for China. So this is a framework from the European Union. It fundamentally talks about all sorts of issues, including security, and there is nothing inherently anti-China and restrictive to China in this. This is from Japan. Again, there are elements which are problematic from a Chinese perspective, perhaps, but again, it's not necessarily something which is talking about containing China, suppressing China, and even in their actions, essentially, I think there is a recognition that it's very difficult to contain the largest economic actor in the region. This is from South Korea. And again, what you will see is that there is not necessarily an element of containing China at all in this. And this finally, this is the ASEAN outlook. Again, if you look at all of these, essentially what each of these are telling you, and it's too much to take in one go, but essentially what each of these are telling you is that there is a certain framework of operation, there's a certain normative governance framework that needs to be developed within the region to achieve all these different objectives that each of these different Indo-Pacific strategies talk about. China does have a role to play in all of these, but the approach of this is to ensure that China doesn't dominate unchecked the sort of future of the region. And that's where this framework is. It's about framing the strategic environment within which China is going to operate. China has to be a part of that framing in many ways, but it needs not, but the idea is not to be able to control and contain its ability to dominate that, and for its dominance to go unchecked. And therefore, you're looking at all of these different strategies where you're trying to engage with China as constructively as you can, while trying to sort of make sure that its worst tendencies are limited. Now, how have the Chinese looked at all of this over the years? And I'll give you a bit of a quick sort of scan again. When the idea of the Indo-Pacific, and I mean the first sort of references that I could find in amongst the US sort of elite policy community was Hillary Clinton talking about it in 2010. Of course, then we had the pivot to Asia and subsequent evolution, which I've talked about. From a Chinese perspective, if you look at how their analysts, scholars, policymakers, how their individuals affiliated with think tanks, affiliated with different ministries, how they were discussing the Indo-Pacific, they basically saw it initially as an immature concept, which was something extremely ambiguous and vague, and that was so rife with inherent contradictions that it's unlikely to become something coherent. There was also a concern that it was fundamentally targeted at China, and this is the US reorienting its strategic posture, realizing that China is emerging to become a near-peer competitor. There was concern about whether this is grand strategic shift like what I've defined, or whether this is just pivot to Asia, some sort of a muddled change away from the problems of the Middle East, plus India in some way. And again, that led to a bunch of sort of sponsoring of internal assessments. So this is a paper by a scholar called Boma, who put together references and discussions about the idea of the Indo-Pacific among the Chinese think tank, intellectual, strategic affairs community, publications of papers. And you can see that there's a certain point at which this arises. In 2017, Trump, when he visited Asia, he spoke about the Indo-Pacific region as a construct, and that's when you saw this rise in studies around the Indo-Pacific. This is a graph detailing the affiliations of different institutions that were doing these studies, and you can see a lot of this was funded by the government. This is the kind of topics that they were covering. So there was a recognition that there are multiple different actors who are going to have different approaches, and you need to try and figure out what each of these is thinking about the Indo-Pacific to be able to come to some sort of a conclusion. Unfortunately, before they could arrive at some sort of a nuanced assessment, what you did see was that at least as the pandemic hit and as China-US competition worsened under Trump, you saw this sense of systemic threat from the United States becoming solidified in the imagination of the Chinese political elite. Fu Ying's quote from June 2020, this is at the height of the pandemic, sort of captures that, right? Again, a very suave diplomat who's gone from, I mean, this was resonating Wolf Warrerism, which she's not necessarily known for. But yeah, the idea was that there was this deepening sense that there was a systemic competition and the United States was fundamentally interested in overthrowing the regime, which again is a core interest that Professor Nadkarni spoke about. And that sort of then amplified into this framework, which now the director of the Foreign Affairs Commission and then Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke about. He talked about the 5-4-3-2-1 formation. So at the outside is a circle of the Five Eyes Alliance, inside is the Quad, then you've got the triangle of the AUKUS, and then you've got US alliance networks, and at the heart of it all is containing China. This is the worldview that Beijing is articulating. And there is little reason to believe that, there's little reason not to believe that it's not a worldview that they have imbibed. And there's a particular reason why they're articulating this quite vigorously without talking about the public goods component of the Indo-Pacific. So for example, if you're going to view the world from this prism, when the Quad grouping announces the IPMDA, the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness, if you look at what Chinese scholars, analysts, and think tankers and affiliated individuals of the government are writing about the IPMDA, they call it the first real measure by the Quad which has teeth. which can contain China. How can the IPMDA contain China? Well, primarily, it'll start laying blame on Chinese fishing vessels which are engaged in IUU. Is that not in the interest of the Indo-Pacific as a region as a whole to be able to deal with IUU? But the articulation here of the IPMDA as fundamentally aimed at containing China by Chinese analysts is essentially a product of this worldview, and it's also an attempt at trying to dissuade other countries from participating, engaging with, and creating frameworks which can be also used for public goods. Of course, they can be used for other things also, but can be used for good of the Indo-Pacific as a whole. This is, and I've added this quote, it's too long to read, I understand, but this is just a continuation, a reflection of the fact that, and I did this purposely because in the last couple of weeks there have been a lot of reports about how is wolf warrior diplomacy going away? Is China now going to be going back to building friends because of the change in, because of Qin Gang becoming the foreign minister, Zhao Lijian being shifted away from the spokesperson's desk to the boundary affairs unit. I think that it's really important to keep in mind that these are structural perceptions. They don't go away just because you had a couple of personnel change at the level of the foreign ministry. These are deeply held views, and this is also a structural view of how the world is evolving from the Chinese leadership's perspective. So none of this is going to go away. We are going to see, still you're going to see this level of competition. But is it in Beijing's interest to sort of put a floor underneath the US-China relationship, which is in free fall? Yes, of course, because neither side really wants confrontation. So, to sort of summarize what China's responses have been and what they're doing, therefore, because of this worldview that they're articulating, the first thing that they're trying to do is to discredit and undermine the US alliance and partnership system. Now, as we've already talked about, right, that it's not that the US is a pious actor going around the world for the world's good. It's got its own interests. I think that it's important for us also to recognize that there are benefits of partnering with the US in different domains, as there are challenges of doing that. So I'll come to the recommendation bit at the end, but what Beijing is essentially going around the world and articulating is that, look, essentially the US is approaching the world from a Cold War framework, and therefore partnering with the United States in any which domain is fundamentally presenting you as being against China's rise and trying to contain China. So it's actually, quite paradoxically, it's actually Beijing which is articulating from a Cold War mentality as opposed to necessarily the United States. The United States seem to have toned down its approach of Cold War, whereas the Chinese have been actually making this case. They've offered a carrots and sticks approach. BRI is part of that, but along with BRI, two initiatives that we've had no mention of in this last 2 days that I've seen is the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative. The Global Development Initiative at least has some meat on the bones. There are certain agreements that have come about. And the Chinese have also learned from the BRI experience. The Global Development Initiative is a much more consultative initiative where member countries are being able to propose ideas. There is sort of, it's not necessarily Chinese proposed measures. Also, these are not necessarily huge stakes of investments that are going in under the Global Development Initiative. And to me, there are significant positive elements which countries in the Indo-Pacific should consider. The Global Security Initiative, on the other hand, is a vague idea which she articulated in April 2022. It's got 6 principles which are very broad, somewhat sort of motherhood and apple pie, all fairly sort of anodyne sounding and lofty. But if you look at the heart of it, what he's arguing for is some of the things that Mr. Guruswamy talked about, which is trying to sanction-proof the Chinese economy, sanction-proof China's trade, try to enhance trade in local currency. And again, Mr. Guruswamy articulated why that's so difficult to do for all countries. Along with that, it's talking about deepening security cooperation around the developing world. This would take the form of, likely take the form of sort of incorporating existing military partnership agreements, new sort of military training agreements, perhaps building of military facilities in other countries, along with policing cooperation. We've seen something come about in the Solomon Islands. So you'll see more of this. You're also likely to see much more work with the developing world on shaping norms of governance. This could be around digital technologies. China has a global data security initiative. Around human rights. In 2017, China held a conference on sort of South-South human rights dialogue, which essentially made the case that human rights are particular and not universal. So your national conditions matter to what kind of rights your humans can have. And that's an argument that it's trying to articulate. And you're going to see much more of this. Along with that, of course, you've seen the sticks. We've noticed the sticks along the LAC and in other places too. So that's essentially what its response is. And finally, it's trying to sort of look at what kind of new regional institutions it can build. Because its concern is that in terms of new sort of governance frameworks in the Indo-Pacific, it will be excluded. So therefore, it wants to sort of create new frameworks to try and make sure that it is part of that dialogue and try and talk to smaller sort of countries within the region to try and bring them on their side so that you can frame some of the rules going forward. And recently there was an attempt at an sort of Indian Ocean dialogue, which sort of fits within this framework of what they're trying to do. Final slide before I end. Okay, so what should countries in the Indo-Pacific do? To my mind, there are three broad things that we should do. One is that it's foolhardy to say that you're not going to be engaging with one of the largest economies in the region, the biggest trading country in the world. So you're going to be working with them. But it's important to look at diversifying your sort of investments, diversifying your stakes. To me, this is actually an opportunity for countries like India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives, and others, because it's always an opportunity when you can hedge against two great powers that are looking to outdo each other and compete with each other. So there's an opportunity to hedge, there's an opportunity to balance, but that comes with risks. So particularly when it comes to technology, it's really important to start thinking about what are the strategic challenges of buying into certain systems, such as the pay-to system, and can you have diversified strategies? And if in certain cases you can't, because it's not possible to have your cake and eat it too, that's when values come into being, saying, well, what is it that at the end of the day, this system will tie me into a system of governance of, and therefore it's important to sort of consider values. And I would presume that all of us here believe that having the ability to nurture a free society with freedom of expression and speech is much more important than being a little bit more well off. So I think that's the kind of transaction that we need to make. That's the kind of trade-off that we need to make. It's important for countries in the region to reinforce to Beijing that it must desist from Cold War thinking. That it must not view our partnerships with other countries or with the United States from the prism of its own competition with the United States. I think this is something that China has done quite badly with India. It continues to view India from the prism of its competition with the United States and doesn't necessarily accord agency to India at all. And I think that's a flaw, and I think it's important for us to sort of reinforce to Beijing that it needs to desist from Cold War thinking. And finally, it's important to engage in norm building to limit potential abuse of the global commons. So whether it's with regard to marine pollution, whether it's with regard to piracy, whether it's with regard to fishing, it's important for the region and actors in the region to come up with solutions so that as competition within the Indo-Pacific worsens and deepens, at least you have a framework that you're talking about and you have provided solutions for yourselves, which you can then hold some of these actors who may be coming from other parts of the world accountable to. With that, I'll stop. Thank you so much.